Okay, I think we'll get started. It's almost 7 minutes past the hour. So welcome to the second Fairbanks Center Modern China lecture of the spring. My name is Arunabh Ghosh. I teach modern Chinese history in the history department here. I also convene this lecture series. Before I proceed with introducing our speaker of the day, I want to take a minute to share with you information about our final lecture of the semester. 2 weeks from now, on April 3rd, which is a Wednesday, not our usual Tuesday meeting day, on April 3rd, we will host Ulu Kuzuolu from Washington University in St. Louis. He will deliver a talk entitled Codes of Modernity, Chinese Scripts in the Global Information Age. And although not a part of this series, I'm very happy to share that we will also be joined in mid-April by Joseph Esherick and Steve McKinnon. Joe Esherick on April 15th, I think, and Steve McKinnon on April 18th. So please look out for those posters and join us then. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to the Fairbanks Center Professor Christopher Courtney. Chris is Associate Professor of Modern Chinese History in the Department of History at Durham University in the UK. He is a social and environmental historian of modern China. His research and teaching have focused on 4 related themes: China, obviously, disasters, environment, and, as we were joking earlier, Wuhan. Wuhan and its hinterlands in particular are the geographic focus for much of his research, and it's a region, as he also just told us, he has lived and researched in for about 5 years. Chris received his PhD from the University of Manchester, and he has held postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Cambridge and at the National University of Singapore. He's the author of a fantastic book called The Nature of Disaster in China, the 1931 Yangtze River Flood, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And in it he offers what he says is the first major study of the 1931 Central China Flood, which he describes as an unknown event, though one could argue that after the book, it's hardly an unknown event. But it ended up killing in excess of 2 million people. And Chris really approaches this history in a very innovative way, offering sort of 6 different perspectives to understand the flood and its aftermath. So he looks at environmental, ecological, cultural, sensory, institutional, and social sort of uses all of these lenses to look at the Yangtze River flood. The book was awarded the 2019 John K. Fairbank Prize of the American Historical Association, and I cannot recommend it enough. If you haven't read it, I would highly, highly recommend you find yourself a copy. Chris has also published widely on various other topics: the mismanagement of disasters under Mao Zedong, the fate of environmental religion in modern China, and the impact of industrialization on urban fire. His current research, which we'll hear more about today, focuses on the problem of heat in modern Chinese cities and is part of a larger collaborative project that he began when he was in Singapore, working with scholars from not just Singapore, but also India, Japan, and Korea, examining together the problem of urban heat islands in the past, present, and future. And I understand that he has also recently begun working on the history of Wuhan's Indian community. I don't know where that research is going, but of course we won't hear more about that today. I'll get to quiz him about it later on, I guess. But the title of today's talk is Heat in the Urban Environment of Modern China. Before I hand things over to him, just a quick words again for those of you who are familiar, you'll know this. About format, Chris will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes. We'll then have Q&A for about half an hour or thereabouts, with the aim to finish by 5:30 at the latest. Okay, so Chris, a very warm welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much. Excellent welcome. Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me also. Great privilege to be able to speak to you guys today about this topic, heat and the urban environment of modern China. So as has already been mentioned, a lot of my research is about, all my research is really about the city of Wuhan, although I've called it the urban environment because I think a lot of the stuff is generalizable, and there are a couple of examples I've taken from other places that aren't Wuhan as well. So what I'd like to do today is to transport you back to the streets of Wuhan anytime between roughly the 1950s and the late 1980s during the summer months. I mean, maybe some of you experience this for yourself. But around about 5 o'clock in the afternoon during those times, young children and the elderly people from families would bring out basins of water around 5 o'clock in the afternoon and begin to pour them onto the ground to try and dissipate some of the heat that are collected during the day. Then kind of the younger, stronger members of the family would bring out these bamboo beds, such as the one you can see here, marking out an area of territory within the city streets. This would then become their home for the evening. They would bring down their food. They would sometimes share their food with their next door neighbors. People would drink swan meitang, like sour plum juice and ludotang and all these kind of things that within the dietetic traditions of China had this cooling effect on the body. Later, as they finished their meals, people would sit around smoking, maybe the children would play, sometimes old people would tell stories to the young people before it got too late and everyone lay back and attempted to sleep, as you can see there, swatting mosquitoes and listening to the sound of their granddads snoring. And then around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, people would gather up their children in their arms and go back upstairs into their apartments, which were now pleasantly cool, and try to snatch a few more hours of sleep before the sun rose again and plunged people back into this terrible heat of the day. So this was the way that people spent their lives during the summer in one of China's furnace cities, right? One of these cities that's infamous for its heat. And being somebody who researches the city of Wuhan, inevitably, whenever I introduce my topic to people from other bits of China, they would say to me, but how can you stand the heat in that city? It's kind of infamous, has this reputation for being so hot. Not just this, but there's several cities, depending on who you talk to, 3, 4, 5 furnace cities that are generally around the middle Yangtze to the lower Yangtze region. So I was always amazed researching this and having lived there for a long time, the fact that this heat just doesn't seem to feature very much in the environmental history of China. So people, including me, have obsessed about other aspects of climate and meteorology, things like rainfall or the absence of rainfall, and also shifts between larger epochs of kind of temperature with little ice age and things like that. But this quotidian experience of living with heat is just something that seems totally absent. Which is even more surprising when you start to talk to people and you realize this is one of the predominant things they remember about the environment of their city. And it doesn't take very long before people start describing this if you ask them about environmental change in their city. So there's this kind of disjuncture between kind of what environmental historians research and the kind of popular memories that I try to address in my recent research. Did this oral history project in 2019. For obvious reasons, after that, it became slightly more difficult to do oral history in Wuhan, but I have tried to kind of piece together some aspects of the way that people have coped with heat in the city since then, and the way that the city has been transformed by what we see here, which is half of the vapor compression refrigeration cycle. So normally you don't see this. Normally it's all contained within a coil, but here you can see this kind of expansion and compression of refrigerant going around a coil, causing you can see this coil has turned white with the ice. It's kind of absorbed the heat has been kind of expelled and it's created this cooling effect, which I would say together with internal combustion is probably one of the chemical effects that has had the most profound effect upon not just urban but environmental history in the modern era. Of course, it is this refrigeration cycle that is responsible for refrigeration, for the development of cold chains, all of these things that we rely upon for the food that we eat. I'm not going to talk about that today. I do research that, so if anybody has any questions about the histories of fridges and things like that, then I'm happy to answer them. But today I'm going to concentrate more upon the effect this has on people, not cooling produce, but cooling people, and of course, the role this plays within the machines that you see there on this outside of this building in Wuhan that I took a photograph of a few years ago, the ubiquitous symbol of urban China today, these air conditioning units. Air conditioning has conquered China in a really short space of time. So in 1990, virtually no air conditioning in China. To 2002, 44% of urban households apparently had air conditioning, which is, of course, this statistic comes from the People's Daily, so I'm not entirely reliant upon this, but there are statistics from, for example, the International Energy Agency that kind of corroborate this. So by 2017, China is producing 70% of all room air conditioners in the world and installing 45%. So that's a huge amount of this particular type of air conditioning. And it's also become a kind of model for other areas of Asia. Lots of these are now being exported to India, and now the new frontier for air conditioning is Africa, apparently. So, of course, this is also placing a massive burden on the energy system in China. 10% of electricity growth by the IEA, again, is estimated to have come from the air conditioning sector in China today. And 17% of the electricity load that's being used is being used in air conditioning, which of course rises a lot during peak demand seasons in the summer. So if you are interested in environmental politics, carbon emissions, these types of things, then you need to start to be interested in air conditioning. It's a big topic, even though it may sound a little bit boring. And the kind of importance of this technology was demonstrated vividly in 2022 when we had these devastating heat waves all over the world. Right? Even in the kind of terrible little cold area of the North Atlantic where I live in the UK, we also had a heat wave there. We reached over 40 degrees. It was hotter in the UK than it's ever been in Singapore in 2022. But of course, China, they experienced these devastating heat waves, which placed, with all this electricity use, placed a huge amount of burden on the electricity system. They had to ration electricity use. Shopping malls were having to cut down the amount of electricity that they were using during this period. They were only allowed to put their air conditioners on 27 degrees and only allowed to open certain periods of the day. Factories, all from this overuse of electricity by air conditioning. And for good reason, right? So heat is something that people need to get rid of. Heat is now the biggest, most lethal form of environmental disaster in the world. It's overtaken floods and hurricanes and things like this. It kills more people. And it's also specifically, and one of the reasons why I'm interested in it as a kind of urban environmental historian, it is an urban issue, which isn't to dispute the fact that it's also a rural issue. I mean, many farmers die of heat stroke and heat-related illnesses around the world, including in China. But there is a particular aspect of the urban environment which exacerbates the problem of heat, and that is this problem of the urban heat island effect. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this before, but the urban heat island effect is basically, as it suggests, cities become islands of heat that are demonstrably hotter than their rural hinterlands. So I told you I'd have a few references to places that were Wuhan, so I have Beijing, not just because I don't have a map equivalent of Wuhan, so we have, here you can see the kind of very easily see the kind of built up urban area, and you can see it mapped out on this kind of temperature map over here. It's very clear to demonstrate what the effect of urbanization has on heat. And of course, people living in cities suffer as a result of this. So what I'm going to do in my talk today is I want to take back the history of heat islands a little bit further than most people take this back. It's normally things that are studied by geographers, climate scientists who have, with no offense to them, sometimes quite a shallow view of when these processes began. I'm not going to take it back that far. You could take this back to thousands of years. I mean, this has been something that's been noticed by people for thousands of years. I'm just going to take it back to the beginning of the 20th century to think, first of all, how some of these problems of heat developed, how people understood these issues of heat in China during this period, and also some of the ways that people have tried to manage it through various forms of governance and technologies. And in the end, we will return once again to air conditioning. Okay, so beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century, I should say, actually. We start to see this kind of phase of industrialization in China. Of course, there had been some sort of proto-industrialization long before then, but this is kind of big wave of industrialization during this period. And this industrialization creates huge amounts of what's known technically as waste heat. So waste heat is something that is a function of all metabolic processes. So as you're sitting there listening to me, you are producing waste heat, and it's very good that you're producing waste heat, because otherwise you would very soon die from overheating. And if we think about the city as a kind of a metabolism, the metaphor that's often used, cities also produce waste heat, and they have done throughout history, not least for all the humans and animals that are gathered in these particular places, and cooking fires and all these types of things. Industrialization just exacerbates the amount of waste heat that's being produced by industrial furnaces, boilers, things like trains, traffic. All of these things start to create more heat during this particular period. Of course, this isn't quantifiable. Nobody was kind of measuring this problem as it was happening, but what we do see is kind of some sort of qualitative evidence of people describing cities and heat during this period. So the problem of waste heat is being exacerbated by another kind of transition that's happening at this period, which is the shift from okay, another non-Wuhan thing. So the shift from permeable to impermeable surfaces, by which I mean, so throughout most of Chinese history, people have used architectural forms that are relatively permeable. So in Wuhan, they've used things like wood, reed, all of these materials. Earth, to a certain extent, is semi-permeable. All these materials that allow the city to breathe to a certain extent. Then, particularly from the 19th century, you start to see in buildings, things like stone, bricks, and all these types of things, which are less permeable. But the real big change that develops is what we see under our feet with the city streets, things like asphalt and concrete, which begin to coat the landscape of China during this period, and of course now coat much of the landscape of the entire world. So this is a problem in terms of heat, because natural surfaces, permeable surfaces, green surfaces, through processes of evapotranspiration, actually get rid of a lot of the heat that would otherwise gather in cities. When you replace these with asphalt, you end up with the problem that we can see demonstrated in this, which that should say the floor is lava rather than the floor is lava. I don't know why that happens. So I just nicked this off the internet. So it's just, I think, a very good demonstration of the way that this problem works. So 9 o'clock in the morning, 27 degrees. All these degrees are in Celsius. Sorry, I don't work in Fahrenheit. So 27 degrees Celsius, both grass and asphalt, the same temperature. Skip forward to 5 o'clock. The ambient temperature outside is 38 degrees. The grass will have risen to about 40 degrees because of the solar radiation, all this type of stuff. Asphalt, 65 degrees. So you can see the replacement of city surfaces does kind of massively increase the temperature. And of course, this then radiates back out into the city during the night, increasing the temperature. That's why I said at the beginning, all these old people and children came out with these buckets of water to wash down the surface of the street in order to try and get rid of this problem. Well, this isn't something that's discussed in these particular terms in the early 20th century, but there is one group of people who are really attuned to this problem, and that is rickshaw pullers. Not just rickshaw pullers, but people who push wheelbarrows, people who are sometimes called coolies, right? The kind of people labourers who kind of carry around large loads, people who are in continuous contact with this surface of the city streets every single day. And there's articles from the early 20th century talking about the toll that this takes on their feet, the toll that this takes on their bodies. There are even campaigns in Shanghai in the early 20th century to get the people who rent out rickshaws to provide straw sandals for rickshaw pullers because of the huge harm that this is doing to their bodies. So what's interesting about this, one of the things that's interesting is the fact that from this early phase you're starting to see this kind of combination of class politics and heat politics. So heat becomes this kind of medium for talking about class difference during this period, which we will see becomes very much more politicized later in the 20th century. What's also interesting is the way that this heat is being spoken about and the effect that it's supposed to be having on the body. Because although kind of what we would understand as what's happening to these rickshaw pullers as being a form of what's known as exertional heat stroke, which is, as it suggests, is something that affects people who are exerting themselves in high temperatures. What's happening to people's feet is understood as a form of heat poison, or sometimes it's the kind of manifestation of heat qi that is gathering in the city surfaces. And it's not just rickshaw pullers, so there's all these accounts of people coming to the city and being warned, if you get on a rickshaw, you have to turn over the cushion because of all the heat qi that will have penetrated. People being warned not to allow their children to play barefoot on the street because of all these poisons that accumulate as a result of the heat. So those of you who are familiar with all this discussion of jiao qi being kind of whether or not we translate it as berry or something else, it's a similar mechanism, right? So heat's traveling up through the body to cause a disease from these kind of poisons that have accumulated in the environment, but in this instance not resulting in berry, but instead resulting in forms of like zhongshu, which today is translated as heat stroke. So this gives you some sort of insight into the way that people were understanding heat, also some insights into this kind of older way in Chinese culture that people have sought to deal with what are known in biomedicine as hyperthermic conditions. Not to be confused with hypothermic conditions, which is the opposite, right? Being too cold. So hyperthermic conditions, overheated, there have been various ways that people have talked about this. Zhongshu Ye is another way that people have talked about it. So Li Shizhen in Bentao Gamu, for example, talks about this condition called Ye quite a lot, that's caused by overheating in the summer months. So just a random example, just because I could find it on the Wellcome collection, of a poster from the Ming Dynasty, somebody who is succumbed to heat stroke with loss of consciousness. So because of all these references, some people have suggested that hypothermic conditions are amongst the oldest recognized medical traditions in world history. And there are actually equivalents of this Chinese tradition can be found in the Greek tradition at the same time, people talking about these same things. However, I would sound a note of caution, because if you actually look at the way these diseases are described in these ancient texts, they're very different. And they're based upon a conceptually very different model of what we describe as thermoregulation, the way that bodies cope with heat. So one of the things that this summer heat, one of the things that happens to it is it can accumulate in your body and come out months later as a form of kind of febrile disease, as a form of fever. So of course that's not something that we associate with, or biomedical practitioners would associate with these kind of conditions of hypothermia today. There's also all these kind of tricky, weird things that are a bit like heat stroke that don't necessarily correspond correctly, but we might say a heat stroke, but actually in TCM they would say aren't heat stroke. Things like this condition you can see here, like Sha. So this is, again, a kind of toxin that seems to appear in people's bodies that you need to remove using this scraping therapy. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. You scrape the body with like over a coin or a piece of wood, and you get these red blotches all over your skin. You can still see it, like if you go in China today. Like my friend, I went back and she had all these, not for accumulation of Sha, but she said she had too much moisture inside her body to try and get rid of this. So this would seem to be something, and the symptoms are very similar to heat stroke, but it's not heat stroke during this particular period. So this one is from the early 20th century. What's interesting to me is in kind of the biomedical tradition, at exactly the same time, you're having very similar ideas being mooted by people like this guy you can see here, Louis Westerner Sambon, who's this British-Italian tropical medical specialist, who is talking about how all these things that are so-called sunstroke that people seem to suffer from when they go to the colonies aren't really sunstroke at all. They're a form of microorganism which we have yet to identify, which is actually in the soil in tropical countries. So you can see in this instance, and I think more clearly in what he's saying than in this Chinese tradition, a depoliticization of heat. Trying to say that, oh no, all these things that people are saying that they're dying because they're overworked, they're dying because they're overheated, they're actually suffering from some kind of disease. We just haven't found the germ yet. I don't think that transposes very, very completely into this kind of conceptualization, but I think there may be some sort of link. So, in the early 20th century, there's a kind of recognition of both of these systems of thermoregulation. They're kind of coming together, what would nowadays be called TCM, with the biomedical tradition. And there are even articles talking about the old way to deal with heat stroke versus the new way to deal with heat stroke. So the old way is generally, give them herbal medicines, this type of stuff, versus the new way, which to a certain extent is similar to what people would recognize today in biomedicine. So take them to a shaded area, good idea. Give them lots of strong alcohol, probably not what would be prescribed today. But there's all these kind of mixing of these traditions, which we'll see throughout the 20th century. Which leads to the question, if now people are beginning to recognize for perhaps the first time that you're supposed to cool people down when they're overheated, which has actually been something that's controversial in both European and Chinese medical traditions up to this point, how the hell do you cool somebody down if they're overheated at this time? So one of the things you could do throughout a lot of Chinese history, actually going back thousands of years, is to rely upon ice. So Chinese people have been storing ice since at least the Han Dynasty. By the late imperial period, they have a very sophisticated infrastructure, not just of ice storage, but I would say they developed the idea of the cold chain a lot earlier than both Europe and America. In fact, we know consciously that the European cold chain was stolen. The idea was stolen because we know who did it. It was like one of William Dalrymple's grandfathers who did this at the time. So you could cool down with ice harvested from nature. You could also, by the early 20th century, cool down using ice produced using mechanical production systems. So here from Wuhan, for example, we have the ice factory that people used to buy their ice from. I don't think either of these was necessarily superior. I mean, it's always seen as this is kind of the modern industrial one, and this one does last longer, but at the time they were actually quite competitive with one another, and both said that the other one was unhygienic. Actually people would make ice in paddy fields, so there's this kind of conflict at this particular period. So ice is used to a certain extent for these new luxuries, things like ice cream, which appears in the Republican period, then disappears in the Maoist period, and appears again in the era of Deng Xiaoping, and things like chilled drinks and all this type of stuff. But again, there is some prohibitions against drinking cold stuff. This is particularly a gendered prohibition against drinking cold stuff at this period. So more during this period, people are relying upon other ways to derive thermal comfort, which include various architectural forms. So China, again, has a very long tradition of these kind of these what they call the sky wells in houses, and all these kind of very sophisticated systems of cross ventilation that work really well to cool down buildings. The historian Li Haiqing has also found evidence of these kind of early air conditioning systems, which you can kind of see is an air conditioning system that runs on what John McNeill would describe as this somatic energy, so the muscles of human beings. So what's happening is you have like cold air in this channel on the outside that's sucked in through this person turning this winch, and then it kind of piped underneath through this pipe, and it's coming up at the feet of these guys enjoying their cup of tea on the other side. So this is kind of a clear expression of the inequality of cooling politics during this period, right? This guy is heating himself up, doing all this energy, in order to cool these people down on the other side. So it's a bit similar to what you'd find in India, with the British using like a punkah. There were some punkahs in China, which is a big ceiling fan that would waft around, and people would pull the rope. You'd have a punkahwala who would pull the rope, heating himself up in order to cool the imperialists down. In this instance, it's some guy turning the winch, or some person turning the winch. I don't know quite how widespread these are. Li Haiqing has this diagram. I'm not sure if many people were using these. Of course, most people are relying on a much simpler form of somatic energy, which is just doing this, right? Cooling yourself down with a hand fan. Hand fans are ubiquitous throughout Chinese history. They have huge cultural meaning. And one of the things that's come out from my interviews actually is the deep cultural meaning of fans, not just in terms of, kind of ornate fans being sold on the international market, but the cultural meaning in the sense that who cools down who in the family. So parents wafting their children to go to sleep, young children wafting their grandparents. It's a kind of an expression of love. And it's kind of something that persists until the present day. But of course, in the early 20th century, the ubiquity of the hand fan begins to be challenged by the arrival of a newcomer on the market, which is the electric fan. So the electric fan you can see here being pictured in a fierce conversation with the hand fan, which is at the time described in this article as this standoff between tradition and modernity. Of course, most people couldn't afford an electric fan in the early 20th century, and most people couldn't afford electricity in the early 20th century. They weren't attached to the system. But it does become this symbol of urban modernity for a certain type of relatively wealthy urban citizens during this particular period. But of course, as a symbol of modernity, there were some people who were somewhat against these kind of newfangled technologies that were arriving. And the objections are again couched in traditional thermoregulation terms, in terms of one of the things that is considered really bad, again from like Li Shijian onwards, is cooling down the body too quickly. If you're too hot and you cool down the body too quickly, you can cause all sorts of bone blockages and all this type of thing. Again, this is something that until the 19th century is shared by European medicine, where they thought the worst thing you could do for somebody was to give them too much water when they were hot. What they would do instead is put you in a warm bath and open your veins, bleed you, which you can imagine didn't have a particularly good effect on survival rate. I think both of these, I have no evidence for this, but my assumption is that what happens in both these cases are somebody gets heat stroke, they're really thirsty, they drink loads of water, and then they die. And so people think, oh, they died because they drank so much water rather than they died because they overheated. So it seems to be kind of a fairly logical way that people would come to that conclusion. Anyway, back to fans. So people are objecting to fans because they cool the body down too quickly. There's also some objections about unnatural wind. Wind as well as cold is a kind of malign force that can cause illness. So unnatural wind is not good for you. Also, people are still coming to terms with this idea that there's all these forces like oxygen, another kind of chi that's in the atmosphere, and they worry that what fans are doing is kind of blowing away all this oxygen from the face, and they're going to cause people, particularly children, to suffocate. So my colleague John Lee, who does Korean history, he told me this is actually still a prevalent fear in Korea today. If you kind of put a fan on, then you can suffer from like fan death. I've actually experienced this taking my own children over to China, and my in-laws will freak out if I put a fan too close to them. It's supposed to be really, really bad for their health. Quite how widespread this is in the early 20th century, I don't know. There's certainly a lot of articles about it, including articles which indicate that one particular person who objected to the use of electric fans, Chiang Kai-shek, right? So Chiang Kai-shek is anti-electric fan. So he thinks that instead of using electric fans, people should be going to places like Moganshan or Lushan to enjoy the wild scenery and the natural coolness. Of course, this isn't something that most people who are living in a city can afford to do, so they have to rely on other ways of keeping cool. And from the late 1920s, another way of keeping cool does arrive in China during this period. And it arrives first in places that you can see here, in cinemas, and sometimes in elite hotels and in banks. And this is, of course, the technology of the air conditioner. This is the modern translation. You can see it's kind of a literal translation of air conditioner. At the time, it's not known as this. At the time, it's literally like a cold chi device, sometimes a cold chi machine, like long chi ji. So what's interesting to me is that this technology, this kind of understanding of this technology belongs in the same kind of framework as these traditional medical theories. It's a machine that is creating cold chi, and that's how it's cooling you down. Actually, it is an air conditioner. That's how air conditioning works. It isn't through the creation of cold chi. So this starts to develop, of course, at this stage, huge systems. You need to kind of build them into the architecture of a building before you build them. Very expensive. So it's people like cinemas that know that they can make more money by charging people to come into a cool movie screen. It's the same thing that happened in the United States. They're some of the earliest adopters of air conditioning. So it seems that at least elite treaty port areas are beginning to follow this model that's been pioneered in America towards air-conditioned modernity, but then the Japanese invade. So it's the Japanese invasion that really prevents the importation of all of these devices into China. And then by 1949, there is a little bit of a kind of air conditioning industry in China. It's used for cooling down produce and cooling down medicines and things like that. But to a large extent, the air conditioning system does not develop under the Mao era. Of course, this is a bourgeois technology. Like, the last thing that they're going to be supporting is people installing air conditioners in their homes. However, this does not mean that the Maoist state is oblivious to the importance of heat, because heat, of course, is, as I mentioned already, a class problem. So this idea that's developed in the kind of literature in the early 20th century as heat as a metaphor for class distinctions is really refined in the Mao era. Here we have a kind of pamphlet from the early Mao era talking about kind of who are the types of people who are affected by heat. Well, it's the urban workers, the soldiers, and the peasantry, specifically the types of people that the Maoist state has framed itself as the champions of. So partly we can see that in propaganda ideological terms, they have a kind of necessity to be dealing with the problem of heat. But it's also increasingly over the beginning of the 20th century has become a strategic and economic imperative. So the beginning of the 20th century, particularly in the United States, but also in other countries as well, there's been a huge amount of research into thermoregulation because people have started to realize if their workers overheat and if their soldiers overheat, then it impairs their performance. They can, in fact, die. So they need to pay more attention to heat as a kind of strategic and economic imperative. Of course, all the things that are being advocated in America, things like importing air conditioning and all these types of things, aren't necessarily feasible in China. So instead, they develop a new mode of heat stroke prevention a new form of governing heat. So here we have a kind of a poster from one of these heat stroke prevention. This is kind of a rural poster, but there are equivalents in the city as well. So there's new legislation brought in to determine what is the maximum temperature that the outside temperature can be, where a factory is still allowed to open. Anecdotal evidence from talking to people in Wuhan suggests that when they set that maximum temperature, what you find is the weather forecast never quite reaches that high, so they can always keep, I don't know if that's true or if it's not. There certainly is some manipulation of these statistics that I know of, actually later than the Mao era. So there's maximum temperatures. There's also heat stroke prevention work is something that work units are supposed to be doing during this particular period. Things like providing drinks, providing shaded areas. If you're working in heavy industry, things like asbestos curtains and all these kind of things that no doubt have dreadful consequences today for protecting urban workers. So the historian Liang Yao, who's written about the history of soft drinks, has also discussed how during this period you see the development of salted soda. It's basically like an isotonic drink like you might have when you're playing sport, but without any sweetener. So it's basically just fizzy brine as far as I can tell, which to me sounds disgusting, but apparently was really liked because it was kind of only exclusive factory workers who worked in these kind of exclusive jobs were allowed to have rations of this. So they took over all the old Coca-Cola factories in Shanghai, for example, and converted them into making isotonic drinks for urban workers. So this heat stroke prevention is, I don't know how realistic all this propaganda is. Certainly the people who I've interviewed describe some measures being taken to cool them down. So I interviewed some people who used to work in cotton factories who discussed how they had like a ceiling fan. This woman who's next to two massive, great big cotton spinning, whatever they're called, I can't remember, they're just packing out all this heat all the time. They've got one ceiling fan. Another lathe worker who I interviewed, she said that they actually bought ice from that ice factory that I mentioned before, big chunks of ice, and they would blow ice over in order to try and cool workers down. They used to do this during the Gaokao as well, apparently, for students before they had air conditioning. Another aspect of this is to try and educate the masses about what heat stroke actually was. So I've got a few of these. This is kind of probably the best one. This kind of propaganda text really kind of trying to educate the masses the dangers of heat stroke. And so by this stage, the idea about thermoregulation seems to be largely based upon a biomedical definition of what constitutes overheating. Yet interestingly, some of the therapies that they advocate are still based in the traditional canon, which include the aforementioned scraping therapy, gua sha. So this is advocated as a way of trying to beat heat stroke. So this text says, but essentially, if somebody is really sick, take them to the hospital. If they're a bit sick, you might as well try this. It's pinching therapy. It's similar during the same period. But what has happened, this is now being pitched as a kind of a folk method for dealing with heat stroke, but the logic behind it is still biomedical. So they say that rather than trying to rid the body of this toxin, what this is doing now is it's opening up the blood vessels and increasing the flow of heat from the body. So we see a kind of biomedical justification being used for a Chinese medicinal practice. So people like Liz Qi and Sean Sanglin Lei, who talked about the scientization of Chinese medicine during this period. This is an example of scientization in terms of heat. What you'll notice also is the fact that all of these heat stroke prevention techniques, they're almost all based upon occupational health. There's very little that's to do with public health. There's very little to do with cities being too hot. It is people working in cities who are too hot. And one demonstration of this is if you just compare media descriptions in the early 20th century to media descriptions in the Mao era of the concept of the heat wave, like Rulang. So there are lots and lots of mentions of heat waves in the 1930s and 1940s, and then they virtually disappear during the Mao era. There are two times in which you can read about heat waves, as far as I can see, just looking at things like the People's Daily and stuff like that. One is when people go and visit steel foundries and a great wave of heat hits people as they open the furnace. And the other is the great heat wave of love that the people have for Chairman Mao. So that's the two times that you see these two things being mentioned. And again, in the 1980s, this discourse starts to return. So it's an occupational, not public health issue. And so in terms of cities being too hot, people have to rely on what I said at the beginning, right? So people have to rely on these, particularly in cities like Wuhan, these cities, these furnace cities, they have to rely on the bamboo beds, the impermeable surface which they can create above the permeable surface of the city in order to cool themselves down. So we can think about this as, to a certain way, people improvising for themselves in the Maoist city. Yeah, I do think in some ways this is also indicative of the urban form that we see during this particular period, because this system is really reliant upon the forms of public housing, work unit housing, that existed in China during this particular period. So in Wuhan, for example, 90% of people living in work units. Sometimes these are even walled off. Certainly everybody knows who's working around. It's highly surveilled. So this idea that at that time my neighbours were like my family, we all trusted each other, is to a certain extent a product of the particular urban form that exists during this particular period. And so to a certain extent then when people have nostalgia about this, they are of course remembering more than just the practice of sleeping outside. So this particular form of urban housing is kind of one way that people are keeping cool during this period. There are also some other idiosyncratic ways that I've found out from interviewing people that people kept cool. One of them was from the 1970s, when you have this big campaign, dig deep tunnels, store grain everywhere. This campaign when basically China is worried about being bombed both by the US and by the Soviet Union, and they have this huge program of civil defense digging these tunnels underneath all of the cities. Well, thankfully, they never had to use these to defend themselves from being bombed, but what they did find is that these were an excellent way to defend themselves from heat. And so people said that they kind of dug out these massive networks of tunnels throughout all the cities, and then they would go and sleep in them in the middle of the summer. And in fact, you can still see these if you go to Wuhan today. There's still some of these aviation tunnels, which until the 1980s were still places that people would sleep outside. Actually, in Chongqing, people would still use the air raid defenses that were built during the Second World War against the Japanese invasion to sleep in during the summer, during these periods. There is even some innovative people at this stage who wanted to utilize the power of this underground cooling to develop new forms of air raid shelter air conditioning that you can see here, in which you've got like this air raid shelter here, then the cool air is being piped through here and coming up through these vents here. So this is quite similar in some ways to the picture I showed you before, only the human being who's having to winch all of this cool air through is now being replaced presumably by an electric pump here that's pumping cool air. So I think these were actually used and have been used to a certain extent in some areas, but I don't know how far they were used throughout China during this period, or whether if the Maoist developmental path had been continued throughout the 1980s, now China would be cooling itself down with air raid shelter air conditioners and coal-powered fridges and earth refrigerators and all these other crazy inventions that they came up with in the 1960s and 1970s. But of course, this didn't happen because of the sweeping reforms that happened in the 1980s, which manifested themselves in a kind of re-importation of all of these technologies we saw in the early 20th century, which return under Deng Xiaoping. So the first of these that returns is not air conditioning, but is in fact our old friend, the electric fan. The electric fan, as far as I can see, no longer causing huge amounts of worries for people for the kind of artificial wind it's creating. So in the Mao, at least amongst the people who I researched, I interviewed in Wuhan, nobody had a fan in the 1970s, and then everybody has a fan in the 1980s. It becomes one of these things, you know, there are these ubiquitous things you have to buy when people get married. So in the 50s, it's like like a sewing machine and a bike. That was the aspiration, at least. In the 1980s, very quickly, the electric fan, certainly in Wuhan, becomes something that people are supposed to buy. And it fits in quite nicely with the system of cooling that exists, right? So you're still sleeping outside on a bamboo bed, but now you can also prop up an electric fan there and cool down your family. Perhaps you also, one person in the neighborhood might have a television. And so everybody would sit out, this fan would blow over them, they would watch TV. So it kind of molds together these forms of cooling. Of course, this is not something that happens with the next technology that comes along, which is, of course, the air conditioner. first coming along as these kind of window air conditioners, later replaced by these split system ductless systems, which are actually innovated by the Japanese. I think that's a history that's never been told. So these systems only work literally if you close your doors on your neighbours. So it's this that sounds a death knell for this older practice of sleeping outside. Physically cannot use these in concert with these older practices. And that is one of the reasons why the air conditioner is such a potent symbol for people in Wuhan today of the way that their city has changed. And something that people both embrace and also slightly reject at the same time, because the air conditioner is seen as the technology that has allowed for the creation of what we see here, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with now, the ubiquitous scene of the urban landscape, these mass high-rises that exist everywhere that have just conquered China over the last couple of decades. So these high-rises, of course, people enjoy the luxury of living in them to a certain extent, but at the same time, they miss certain elements of the communal lifestyle they used to enjoy. These high-rises, for various different reasons, require you to use air conditioning. They have big glass windows. They also contribute to the urban heat island effect. So the urban heat island effect, one of the things that kind of exacerbates it is this what's called the urban canyon effect, whereby these high-rises trap heat between them. So the more high-rises you have, again, the hotter your city will become. It's kind of extending the impermeable surface up into the sky. So air conditioning has become a way of life, really, in a very short period of time. It's something that people really, in the hotter months of the year in Wuhan, cannot avoid. And it's probably for that reason that people have started to worry about the effect that always living in an air-conditioned environment is having upon their bodies. And so once again, we see with this new condition, air conditioning disease, that there is lots of online articles about, there's journals. So TCM journals have lots of articles talking about this air conditioning disease. We see again this kind of blending of different medical traditions in the way that people are understanding their relationship between their bodies and heat and their relationship between their bodies and technology. So here we have a guy who has apparently slept underneath an air conditioner all evening and then develops facial paralysis as a result. So other symptoms of air conditioning or other kind of descriptions of air conditioning disease suggests that one of the things it's causing is cold damage, right? So it's literally the diseases that you would have by all this lung qi that's blowing at you is the same sort of disease that you would normally expect to contract in the winter, but because you're having this artificial cold blowing at you, it's now causing these types of disease. At the same time, some people describe how air conditioners themselves are repositories for viruses and bacteria that circulate within the home. So again, we see this blending of different medical traditions. So I'm not a medical doctor, TCM or biomedical, so I can't really comment on the kind of veracity or lack thereof of air conditioning disease. What we do know, however, in terms of urban environmental history is that air conditioners have contributed to this urban heat island effect that I was talking about before. So here is the statistics just from Wuhan. This is from these guys who I met at the Wuhan University of Geosciences. You can see these. What's really important is the divergence of these blue and red lines, which are the rural and urban lines, and you can see they really begin to diverge in the 1990s. Right at the same time, we start to see the use of air conditioning. Not just air conditioning happened then, of course. You have huge amounts of traffic, urbanization, all of these things contributed. But one of the major contributory factors is waste heat that is being produced. As I said, this kind of metabolic process, this waste heat that is being produced. So the air conditioner works through a heat exchange. It sends hot air outside in order to cool the interior. That's why the Singaporean journalist Cherry and George describes it as selfish technology. Right? So you cool yourself down, you make the collective community hot at the same time. So then, what is to be done? So I'm a historian, so I work more on diagnosis than prescription, but I do take some heart in a few things that you can still see in cities like Wuhan today, such as that which you see here. In the middle of the summer, when it's really, really hot, people, particularly elderly people in the city of Wuhan, will get their fold-away stools and they will go to places like shopping malls, food courts, supermarket lobbies, and they will avail themselves of the free air conditioning. So here we can see what happened. This isn't from Wuhan, but this did happen in Wuhan. I saw it. when they opened about a decade ago, they opened the underground system in Wuhan, and all of these elderly people immediately invaded these train stations in order to try and cool themselves down. And there were soon signs posted up everywhere saying, no loitering. So all these old people were kind of being the equivalent of hawkers or beggars, or for some reason people with balloons, which also seems to be prohibited on the Chinese underground network. But I think they've missed a trick there, the Wuhan authorities, right? 'Cause what are these people doing? They're replicating the old culture of the bamboo bed, but in these new public spaces, these new areas where they can share collective air conditioning rather than staying in their hermetically sealed apartments and consuming as individuals. They found a communal way to try and keep their city cool. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. This was really fantastic. I have a bunch of questions. I'll just make one quick comment about isotonic drinks that brought up a memory from my own childhood. In India, on the streets, you would often have these vendors selling some kind of, drinks during the summer months. And typically it's lemonade, so you have lemon, water, and you rarely have sugar, you have salt.
All right.
Right, so it's salty lemonade that gets sold. And I think part of it actually has, again, a health and heat stroke kind of logic in mind.
Masala cola, right?
No, it's not cola.
But masala cola, they put loads of salt in that.
They put salt in it too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but so it's to help you rehydrate, I think.
Right.
So the sugary stuff that comes in is sort of a totally different world in some ways, I think, to this practice. So that's just a small comment. I have a bunch of questions, but I think we have enough people in the audience. I'm going to throw it open to the floor. If you could quickly identify yourself and then ask a question, that'd be great. And if there's no one immediately raising a hand, I'm happy to start. But I see Jason's hand up, and then, yeah, go ahead.
So, Jason Chen, future candidate, history fund. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. Learned a lot. So, two questions. First one is there any sense of local perceptions of climate change, especially sort of a warming trend, not only perceived locally in the urban centers, but also sort of across the PRC itself? Second question is there any cross-pollination of medical sort of research going to tropical diseases and sort of tropical heat prevention from the military, as well as that goes into the PRC sort of technical aid in the tropical areas of the global south, and sort of the knowledge popularization surrounding heat stroke prevention and others of tropical heat diseases sort of prevention. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Two really great questions. In terms of your first question, I mean, you probably know as much as me about the kind of common perception about climate change. What I would note is that when we talk about climate change, of course, we have to talk about macro climate change and micro climate change. One thing that people are aware of is this micro climate change. They're aware of the urban heat island effect. Several people who I interviewed said, since we've got all these air conditioners, the city has got hotter. People are aware of the urban heat island effect, even if they're perhaps not framing it in that particular discourse. Of course, younger people well aware of climate change, and some older people today. I would say probably when I started this research, the perception was less. One of the problems when I was doing oral history is I wanted to ask people about environmental change, but I couldn't really find the right discourse to talk about that. So when I asked them about environment, people would talk about hygiene. And people would talk about various different things. And I think this doesn't come into that. But I think certainly there is a growing awareness of climate change, and particularly 2022, right? I was talking about heat wave. City of Wuhan, the Yangtze River disappeared. That's supposed to be when it's highest point. There's all these people wandering around. So it's events like that that are really beginning to trickle people's understanding. Question on tropical medicine is a question very close to my heart. I've just finished writing actually a paper about this, kind of linked to this, about the history of humidity. Whole section on tropical medicine. So tropical medicine is massively influential in China in the early 20th century, much more so than I think people give it credit for. So I'm struggling to remember the guy's name who's just finished a PhD in looking at tropical medicine. So forgive me, I've forgotten what he's called, but it has a huge influence. The PMUC, of course, the Peking Union Medical College, they are advocates of tropical medicine. Tropical medicine starts in China, right? Patrick Manson. Who is Patrick Manson employed by? Not by the British Empire. He's employed by the Imperial Maritime Customs Service of the Qing. So it starts there. And who is Patrick Manson's most famous pupil? Sun Yat-sen. So Sun Yat-sen's training in tropical medicine. All of these ideas are very influential. So in terms of heat, what they do is the idea of tropical medicine provides a different framework for thinking about the relationship between heat and disease, which retains this environmental feature. So it's called nosogeography, right? So how people get sick in particular climates, particular environments. So it allows people to retain this environment, the sense that particular environments make them sick, but it replaces kind of ideas of poisons and qi with the idea that there's a particular region of the world, the quote-unquote tropics, which applies to China, even though most of China is not, in fact, tropical.
Great, thank you. Aaron?
Shan Yubian, I think, is the person who's written that. Yeah, sorry.
Hi, Aaron Glassman. I'm a postdoc at the Harvard Academy of International Area Studies, historian of China. I have two questions. First, I was wondering if you had thought about the potential comparison with Taiwan as a place that maybe brings a similar kind of cultural medical heritage, but obviously some of the class expressions and interpretations of this phenomenon might be very different or might not. And the second question is about whether you've seen any sort of connections between changing ideas of urban heat and sexual culture and family planning. I mean, was that sort of in their vocabulary when they were convincing people to have fewer children, and did people think about it in terms of how it affected their sexual life as well?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer both of those questions in quite an oblique way, because the really answer is no to both of them. But they are actually spark kind of interesting comparisons. So I haven't ever compared with Taiwan. The one comparison I have done with Taiwan is chatting to Steve Harrell, who of course lived in Taiwan during these periods, and he's talked to me about a lot of the way that people used to keep themselves cool by putting cucumbers underneath their armpits. Apparently used to be a thing that people did. A lot of the things that happened in Taiwan just happened maybe a generation earlier than they happened in China, as far as I can tell. The big comparisons I've made in terms of that is with Singapore, right? I used to live in Singapore. One of my co-authors, we're editing a volume together, this guy Chang Jiet-wei, he's written a lot about the history of heat in Singapore. And we do see a lot of the similar sort of practices. More similarities than you'd think. So Singapore is like the air-conditioned nation, right? So you think all of this stuff happened a lot earlier. But actually, in terms of domestic air conditioning, it's all happening in a lot of Asia in the 1990s. So even in Singapore, in the HDBs and housing like that, all of this stuff is happening in the 1990s. And they have similar concerns in terms of medicine. Of course, TCM is a big thing in Singapore, and there are similar concerns there. And also some of the kind of moral stuff that Chiang Kai-shek objected to in terms of using fans is also replicated there. So one of the things that Jiet-wei found out is, for example, in schools in Singapore, they use air conditioning as a means of kind of control and discipline. So if the students don't behave, they'll turn off the air conditioners. So that's one of the things they did there. So there is interesting comparisons to make. Obviously, we've compared in the project with India and various different places as well. Second question was about sexual culture. I don't know so much. That is something that's intrigued me, actually, about the way it fits into like eugenics, basically, that's being the discourse of the quality child that's being promoted in the 1980s. And we're again going to take us back to the Mao era, in which it is really, really important. So in two different ways. So these concepts of thermoregulation that I've discussed are incredibly gendered. So all of these ideas that women, for example, when they're menstruating, shouldn't eat cold things is kind of this idea of TCM thermoregulation. So together with my friend Loretta Lowe in Durham, we've got this project looking at concepts of gender and thermoregulation within TCM, so the way that women's bodies are conceived about in a particular way. And so the Maoist state is trying to kind of battle against some of these in some of their practices. So one of the ways they do this is through, like, Zuoyueze, where you're supposed to have this sitting-in month after you've had a baby. In the 1950s, there's this big campaign to change the way that people do this, because this idea of lung qi that coming in and causing all these diseases that your body is particularly susceptible to when you've just had a baby meant that even in the middle of the summer, they would wrap women up in huge amounts of clothing, and then some of them would die. Some of them would die of heat stroke because of this, according to the official media sources. I don't know how reliable this data is. So there is a kind of sexual and gendered element to this, but exactly about the 1980s, I would love to know, but I don't actually know now.
Great. Go ahead, please. Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the very nice talk. Actually, I come from the hinterland of Wuhan.
Okay, whereabouts?
It's a bit far away in the north, Xinyang.
Okay, yeah.
In Henan province. Henan, Xinyang. Yeah, thanks. And I'm doing research about the different measures that people take to cope with flood.
Okay.
We're talking about the heat. So it's also very interesting that people use different measures, to avoid being flooded, avoid being damaged by water. I have a simple question that since you studied this work covering quite a long kind of time period, several decades or even 100 years now, do you see or do you identify the change of heat risk against the development of people's adaptive capacity? On the one side, we talk about climate change, urban heat island effect is increasing significantly. But on the other side, our technologies, our measures, our coping strategies, or different tools we use, develops very fast. So current days, there are significantly less people die from heat stroke, I think, comparing with 50 years ago.
I'm going to have to disagree with you on that one.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I know. But that's, when we talk about this adaptive capacity or coping capacity of human societies, we significantly developed our capacity. But comparing with the risk increase, and how do you think this risk increase and this adaptation development trends?
I mean, talking about flooding is a topic very close to my heart. But what I would say is that flooding in some ways is a good metaphor for understanding heat. So one of the things I do when I started to research this, I get away from all of these ideas about flooding. I kind of don't want to do that topic anymore. But then I realized there's all these comparisons. So actually many of the things, the dynamics of societal dynamics you see are actually the same things that happened historically with water in China. Technological lock-in, right? Mm-hmm. With the air conditioner. There's all these similarities. The air conditioner is in fact a hydraulic technology. So the air conditioning functions through removing humidity from the air. So if you walk around, I don't know if it happens in America, I haven't been here very often, but if you walk around a Chinese city, you feel kind of that drip, that horrible drip on your head. That is humidity which has been harvested from the sky. So to a certain extent, the dike and the air conditioner are related technologies, and that the air conditioner is achieving what people have tried to do for a long time, kind of literally sucking the moisture out of the air. Sorry, I've gone off on one a little bit. But returning to this idea, heat stroke fatalities and flooding fatalities have gone in different directions. So flooding, of course, has declined. The amount of people who die from flooding has declined precipitously as a result. Actually, the number of people who are dying from heat stroke is increasing. And if you look at any estimations of what's happening with heat-related deaths in any predictions by the end of this century, it's going to be more and more. If we keep it at 1.5, the kind of 1.5 climate change, which is now looking increasingly unlikely, it's going to be an increase of perhaps 2%. If there's kind of 4% rise, then there's 6% in kind of excess non-accidental death mortality. So actually heat stroke deaths, that's why I say it's the most dangerous hazard in the world today. It's the one hazard type that is really increasing in terms of fatality.
What's the reason? Why?
Urban heat island effect, the fact that more people are exposed to this kind of heat.
Much better health care systems.
So part of it might also be down to the way that statistics are collected, right? So people weren't registering heat stroke mortality, fatalities in the past. There's all sorts of comorbidities that you need to measure in order to determine what is actually a heat stroke death, that can manifest itself in a particular different way. Part of it is also, if you think about a city like Wuhan, there's a kind of hierarchy of hazards historically. So if you were 100 years ago in Wuhan, then the major hazard you're facing, not just flood, fire, and then heat was maybe number 3, or perhaps even maybe kind of being killed in war or something that would be much lower. But actually, as these two things have been dealt with, things like flooding and all these types of things have been dealt with, heat has become kind of the residual thing that people die of. And actually, lots of the things that people have done to tackle floods have increased the problem of heat, the kind of impermeable surfaces.
Probably also the class element that you spoke of also probably gets exacerbated, right? With the way in which you see the people, the mortality is actually even more extreme across class than earlier, where earlier everyone was sort of subject the remedial measures were also relatively close to each other, and now the remedial measures have actually diverged. So the class outcomes have also diverged in some ways. That would be something to probably
So Klinenberg, I think the guy who wrote about the Chicago heat waves, written about this really, really well. Who are the people who die in America? It's impoverished people, people of colour and stuff like that, in particular communities that aren't served well by heat protection plans. And even in a global sense, so it's not actually China that's going to suffer the worst, it's actually Pakistan and bits of Africa are going to suffer really, really, really terrible consequences as a result of this kind of increasing heat.
Great, thank you. Yes, over there, please.
Yeah, I have two questions. One on medicine, the other is on the power of controlling the temperature. Well, I don't know whether you have looked into the Chinese herbal remedy, because I'm from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, I grew up in a generation that I never depend on air conditioner or anything. Of course, now it's completely changed. And there are tons of herbal tea shops, and then they change with seasons. And I mean, the herbal tea changes with seasons. So everyone deal with a particular season. So in the summer, you know, when we want to cool our body down, we actually go to take a herbal tea. And the tea is not cold or anything. It can be warm, you know, or hot. So it actually cools down the body. I don't know whether you have looked into this side of meditation or not. The southern part of China is very famous in this culture because we believe that our water is hot. And then the water in the north of China is cold water, so they don't have to deal with that. But in the southern part of China,
interesting. I didn't know that.
We have big culture in herbal tea to deal with heat.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at that specifically, but the kind of use of herbal medicines to deal with heat is something that, I mean, you can trace it back throughout Chinese history. Like I mentioned Li Zijian, right? He has lots of herbal remedies to deal with heat. Also, lots of different types of water in the Bunsagamui, right? So the types of water you should drink in order to alleviate heat. I mean, we say the same in the UK, right? We drink cups of tea. Best thing to drink in the middle of the summer is a hot cup of tea. I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with that, but yeah. Yeah, sweat is another kind of major kind of issue with kind of thermoregulation. There are all these different theories to deal with how you sweat. And one of the reasons that people object to air conditioning is because it doesn't make you sweat. So it prevents you from sweating, which is, they're saying, well, you need to sweat a certain amount. And if air conditioning prevents you from sweating, then your natural hydrological cycle is thrown out of step.
And the other one is kind of hidden, you know, because Hong Kong's temperature has always been controlled by the colonizer. And when air conditioning was introduced, and because they are much bigger and have much more body fat than us Chinese, the temperature for us is always cold. I work in the financial center of Hong Kong. All the buildings are freezing cold like refrigerators. So especially in the summer, all of us working inside the office, the Chinese, will have a big fur coat. And underneath us, we will turn on high heat, actually. Over there, it's pumping cold air. Down there, we all have private warmers. In the summer. Yeah, and until the moment, you know, I think 20 years ago, something like that, an old lady actually was died of hypothermia in the bus because it's too cold. And we complain and complain and complain and never make changes because the decision maker were always white people.
Yeah.
So, you know, you might like to look into that.
Although who is the person who expressed the need for Chinese people to have air conditioning more than anybody else? Lee Kuan Yew. So Lee Kuan Yew was the kind of the original biological determinist guy in terms of cooling temperatures. So Chinese people needed air conditioning when they were in the tropics, returning to your question about the tropics. So these discourses move depending on where you are. But what's really interesting is it's not just in terms of kind of ethnic difference. Again, it's in terms of gender. So when the engineering standards for what temperature offices should be at are measured, and the kind of history of measuring thermal comfort, what is the default body that is used? it's the white male default body. So actually, there are studies that suggest that actually women prefer temperatures higher. Certain people from different areas, cultural backgrounds, prefer temperatures higher. And I'm also really fascinated in that particular issue. I would hesitate to kind of put it around ethnic lines because there are all sorts of other distinctions as well. And that's one of the reasons I'm endlessly fascinated by things like air conditioning, because they are great prisms for the micro-politics of a particular area. So think about even the household. Who is the person whose hand is on the air conditioning remote control? The generational differences in a city like Wuhan between what old people want and what young people want. And so this older expression of, I was talking about the kind of fanning as an expression of love. So nowadays, older families in Wuhan, a lot of them that I know, would sit in incredible heat all day, and then when the children come home, turn on the air conditioner. So they're expending the energy, and it becomes kind of this expression of love. And they turn on the air conditioner even though they would say that they actually don't like it themselves. So there's all these kind of micro-politics, and I'm sure the dynamics of colonization in Hong Kong played a big role. I know they certainly did in Singapore.
In your research, have you got any suggestion, for the mitigating of such kind of vicious cycle? Because the more hot air we pump, actually now Hong Kong becomes impossible without air conditioning. So the more we do it, the more we need it. Do you have any suggestions for the solution?
I have anticipated this question, because it's the question that I always get asked. I don't, really, like I said, I'm better at diagnosis than I am at prescription. Certainly, this is one thing, I think, thinking about kind of collective action and collective cooling pans. So actually, this type of thing in Hangzhou, they have started doing, and in other bits of China actually using this old infrastructure for cooling people down, particularly during heat emergencies. During a particular period. We can also think about what they're doing in Singapore and develop kind of better forms of air conditioning. So here in Singapore, Airbitat, this company, if you go to NUS campus, they also have these. They have evaporative cooling technologies that they're being used. So you have an air-conditioned bus shelter outside. It's a completely different way of understanding air conditioning from the kind of vapor compression refrigeration cycle. Actually relates to, the swamp coolers they have in some bits of India, for example. It's kind of using that technology. So much less carbon being burnt in order to kind of fuel these type of things. I don't put huge store on these kind of technological solutions to this problem. I think and to a certain extent, I think we just have to come to terms with the fact that as the world gets hotter, more and more people are going to have to use air conditioning. It is kind of a reality of our lives. So just using it better, using more efficient air conditioning, and using it in perhaps more efficient ways. The model that we have, it's kind of terrible that China received air conditioning right at the same moment that it opened up for kind of the type of capitalist reforms it did, because it's adopted an entirely capitalist model of how to develop. There are other ways to have air conditioning. You can have, as I'm sure you guys know in the United States, system air conditioning for an entire building, which can be much more efficient. You can have different forms of air conditioning. Every single household having an air conditioning unit is very inefficient. So I think these kind of solutions, perhaps, but also kind of thinking more collectively.
Hong Yang with Earth and Planet Sciences.
Okay.
I went to college in Wuhan in the 80s.
Oh, really?
So I have a lot of stories here.
Do you recognize some of this?
Yeah, I will recall some of the warm stories. But I have one observation I want you to get your comment, and also one specific question regarding one of your slides. So the observations was when I was in Wuhan or in the 80s, 90s, there's a lot of talk within China about this four furnace. Right, you got Wuhan, Hangzhou, Chongqing, and Nanjing. But later years, in the 20s or in the past a few years when I traveled in the summertime to China, this not mentioned much. So I wonder, was that because all other cities are becoming pretty warm, pretty hot, or because technology that has improved in Wuhan actually you don't? So that's one thing I'd like to get your response.
So two answers to that. There was all of this talk. If I go to this slide here, you see something that happens around kind of 2005. It seems to be the temperature goes down for some reason. So I haven't got like firm evidence to prove this, but numerous people have told me all of this discourse about Wuhan being this unbearably hot city meant that they moved the meteorological center from the city center to a mountain on the outside of town. And suddenly the temperature began to decline. Again, I don't know if that's true. Numerous people have told me that story. It's a bit anecdotal. I would have to do, I'm not able to get into archives in Wuhan to test that kind of thing. And another reason is precisely the thing you said, right? So there's this idea that there's these 3, sometimes 4 furnace cities in China. But actually, Wuhan is not the 4th hot city in China. The hottest city in China, last time I looked, was Hangzhou, which you wouldn't think is hot with all that big lake, right? You'd think it would be cooled down. But it's this kind of urban sprawl has totally changed the heat profile. It comes back to your question, the heat profile of China. So Wuhan is the last time I looked, the 7th hottest city. If you exclude places like Urumqi and Xinjiang that have a different type of heat. Don't tell that to people in Wuhan, though, because they're very proud of being the hottest city in China. So you had another question?
You have slides on Beijing.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's right near the beginning. There we go.
Yeah, so what are the temperature differences between the red color and the blue colors?
I'm afraid I don't have that information. I only included this really to illustrate the problem. You can look at, there are kind of, this was one of many city maps that are all around there. I'm afraid I don't have. We do have, from our project Heat in Urban Asia, we have a website in which we have all of this, which we mapped it out for various different places like Singapore, and we had the temperature data on there. It's from NUS website, Heat in Urban Asia, if you're interested.
Yeah, I wonder if this is an image of satellite of some sort. It's not necessarily temperature gradient. It could be just an image of showing the different city versus vegetation. Obviously, it could be different.
The source I took it from did say it was a temperature map, so I mean, I'm trusting that, but maybe I shouldn't.
So we have maybe about 5 minutes, so why don't we take both questions together, because I saw Anatol's hand up too. Are there any other questions, or? Yeah, so then we'll ask both of them, and then you can take them together, Chris, so then sure. we can wrap up with that. So please.
Yeah, I have a question about the last chart. So,
okay.
You really know a lot about China.
Well, I know some things about Wuhan, I don't know about China. There we go. There you go. That one, yeah.
We know the Earth is warming now. So do you eliminated this effect from this chart, or you only consider the human activities to rise the temperature? Because I know from the rural, I know that in China, the rural countryside, I don't think that there's so much air conditioner, especially from 2000. I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this isn't a chart that I made. This is from these guys I met at the Wuhan the Geosciences University in Wuhan. So they made this. And I would also say that this effect isn't just air conditioning, right? This is the combined effect of the urban heat island effect. Urbanization, concrete, traffic, all of these different things. Air conditioning is one contributory factor, probably not the most important contributory factor. And you can see, yeah, rural areas have also increased in temperature during this particular period. What's interesting about this to me is not necessarily the increase, which has continued to increase. Of course, it's the distance between the two, which is the measure of the urban heat island effect. Yeah. But I would say also in the countryside around Wuhan, they do have air conditioning now, yeah. Sorry, I'm doing it again.
You jumped into answer. I was going to take both questions together, but now
sorry,
Anatol
yeah, I forgot
gets the
that.
final question, so go ahead, Anatol.
I'm Anatol Glass. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. It's really fascinating. I was wondering two things. The first is I know that the PRC has been experimenting with this idea of sponge cities.
Oh, yeah.
Natural solutions incorporated into urban planning. I was wondering if there are some equivalents for urban heat. And then the second is, if while you've been researching this, you found any interesting examples of representations of heat in popular culture and the arts. I was thinking about In the Heat of the Sun as one example, and I'm sure there are many others, and sort of what heat seems to represent when it's used in movies and books and art in the Chinese context.
Yeah, I mean, two really great questions. I'm afraid I don't have a great answer to the kind of sponge city question. I hate to kind of like to play the kind of the poor me researcher. I haven't been able to get into the archives and look at what exactly the kind of the issues are nowadays. But I mean, the sponge city things they're doing also do have beneficial effects for this, right? Kind of increasing green space in general. And there are attempts to increase green space across various different areas in China. Also, some of the things that they've been doing in China to improve air quality, because pollutants are also an exacerbating factor when we think about kind of urban heat as well. So they are doing some kind of positive moves in terms of trying to tackle these particular problems. But I mean, they're running to catch up with a runaway problem that's a global problem at the moment. Cultural representation of heat, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you can see them throughout the entire history. Like, so think about the rickshaw pullers there, Lao Shu and people like that who wrote about that. Or Mao Dun, it's light, heat, power. So the heat is kind of a continual metaphor at that stage for kind of class difference. In Wuhan, heat becomes kind of an expression of kind of cultural identity that you were talking about here. So Fang Fang, who's written about Wuhan a lot, right? So she's written about kind of spending the summer in Wuhan as one of her essays that she's written. She continually talks about this as a kind of an expression of cultural identity. What I'm also interested in is the various, which I didn't have time to talk about today, various other types of cultural identity associated with heat. So one of the things in Wuhan that's an expression of local cultural identity is the way that men don't wear any tops in the summer. And the gradual attempts to control this as a quote-unquote uncivilized way of dressing. And you actually have statues in the middle of Wuhan celebrating this bamboo bed culture with these two guys standing around with no tops, and then really close by there's a sign that says, "Do not walk topless on the street." So at this particular period, back to the kind of 1980s and 90s, actually had like a bare-chested man march in Wuhan to try and kind of express this kind of cultural identity. So it is very, very, very cultural and very, very interesting. We could talk about that throughout East Asia for a very long time. If you want to kind of see the ultimate cultural expression of heat, it's not from China, it's from Japan, right? So watch Kurosawa, Stray Dogs. It's absolutely the best heat film I think that's ever been made.
Do the Right Thing.
Oh yeah, that's another great one, yeah. Although, yeah, I prefer Kurosawa.
Great. Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Chris for a terrific talk and a fantastic discussion. We got to 5:30 without even noticing.
Oh,
so
great, yeah.
I think that's
Thanks so much.
compliment. Yeah.